Very.
Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our session on sex, intimacy, and chronic illness with Jennifer and Sandy. I'll let them introduce themselves and we'll get started.
All right. Yeah, I'm Jennifer. I'm an occupational therapist and been working in this field for quite a while, and I'm excited to be here today. I think as Sandy was saying, as we were discussing before the recording, that this is us coming at this topic from an occupational therapist and physiotherapist perspective, and just to note, right, that we're not sex counselors or sex therapists, but hopefully you might still find this helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I'm Sandy, and I'm the physiotherapist that Jen and I work quite closely with on this chronic complex disease program. And one of the topics that often comes up is, especially in pacing, in activity and movement, activity and values, is sex. And so we're really happy to be presenting this with the lens of an OT and a physio. And understanding the complexity of it.
And we'll be using the Q&A box today. And so feel free to pop your questions in there. We may or may not get to it. We might also kind of select some and not answer others. The other thing that we want to totally invite you to do is to, because we really liked this from the panel discussions we did the other few times, to feel free to share a success story in the Q&A box. And if we can assume that if you put that in there, you're okay with us reading that out loud to share with others, so that we maybe have a bit of a mix of like questions, but also possible, success stories that you might have had kind of dealing with this. So, and then we'll do it at the end. We have the 30 minutes at the end. Yeah. And so I'm just gonna figure out here. There we go. Let's get started.
So, and again, welcome everybody and welcome partners. So today, what we want to really recognize is that living with the diagnosis of ME/CFS and FM can really affect sexuality in different ways. Symptoms like pain, fatigue can get in the way of your sexual thoughts, feelings, and that have actually been a positive part of your life. These symptoms may affect interest in sex. Chronic illness doesn't change the basic human need for touch and intimacy. These ideas is to get a new normal that works for the both of you. And so when we talk about this, sex and the pleasure associated with it, it's still actually considered a taboo. In fact, when Jen and I do these groups in our clinic, it often comes up right at the very end, like we call it sort of the doorknob. People are quite nervous and don't know how to bring it up, but nevertheless, it's an integral part of everyone's health. So we're very glad you're joining us today. At the request, as we've said, of our last session, we've invited partners to join this session. And a partner is a person with whom one shares an intimate relationship. And so it is very important that partners are present today and understand and be part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So again, as Jen said, we also want to provide an opportunity to present successes.
Yeah, let's not prevent successes.
Yeah, we don't want to prevent them. We want to talk about them. So the objectives today are basically to present a good enough sex model, to really describe what sexual expectations are with people with ME/CFS and FM, to explore how to broaden that sexual menu, and present ways to conserve energy and limit pain when you engage in sexual activity. Mm-hmm. So again, why do we talk about intimacy and sex, and recognizing an integral part of your holistic health for every individual? We want to talk about what is sexual activity, and what are the types of intimacy, and what is good enough sex on a good enough day model. What does that actually look like? And then those tips for conserving energy It's really important. So part of this is changing routines and expectations surrounding that connection doesn't undermine the end goal. And so why is this all important to address? Sex and intimacy can be crucial for many people to maintain their comfort connection with their partner and to manage stress. So we talk about what are the benefits of intimacy and sex. A big one is natural pain. It releases endorphins. It helps our immune function, our heart health, stress relief, and actually improves our sleep. And recognizing people with chronic illness and chronic diseases are sexual people too. And often what we hear from people is, I don't have enough energy for sex. I don't feel like myself anymore. My body feels uncomfortable, like my enemy. I can't enjoy sex when I'm always in pain. If you experience any one of these symptoms or thoughts, we hope we can share ways to address these issues. How can sexual function be affected by complex chronic diseases? And this is quite interesting, is that people with ME/CFS and FM it has a major impact on your sexual health of both men and women. And they did a study and they showed women who have been diagnosed with ME/CFS have 60% have sexual dysfunction. Women diagnosed with FM have 75% diagnosis of sexual dysfunction. And there's been very little data on men, but we recognize equal sort of, not maybe equal numbers, but equal issues. And so we start to see these are big numbers. And sexual dysfunction really looks at problems with arousal, problems with orgasm, problems with sexual activity. And one of the things that we recognize is that with people with ME/CFS and fibromyalgia, some of these difficulties arise from avoiding contact. Because if you're dealing with persistent pain, often that sensitivity to touch feels like pain now. It's no longer a normal touch sensation or a pleasurable touch sensation. It's actually, touch can be very, very painful. Fatigue is a very much part. If you have an energy envelope that is very small and you're just basically coping with self-care, the idea of an activity like sex is really difficult. And the same with intolerance to physical activity. It could result in post-exertional malaise. Mood becomes involved. The side effects of medication are sometimes an issue. And that altered self-perception is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's look at this difference between sex and intimacy, and really to recognize, right, that often we think of sex and intimacy as the same thing, and they're not necessarily the same. So sexual activity and intimacy are not necessarily the same thing. There's countless ways to be intimate, and yeah, most of them aren't actually sexual. Generally, talking about our desires can be really difficult. As Sunny was saying, there's often a big of a taboo on that. It can make us feel really exposed and vulnerable. And unfortunately, often vulnerability is sort of equated with weakness. However, intimacy really is the closest between two people. And this can include sexual activities, but it's not limited to that. And so, when we think about this too, there's intimate sex or sexual activity, and then there's also unintimate sex. So intimacy without sex is possible, and sex with intimacy. So when you're thinking about intimacy, it's really, being close to someone in a manner that isn't about what they bring or what they do, right? It's about that connection and that closeness. And so, this thought of, can you explore other ways of intimacy that might not necessarily be sexual activity? And that can really alleviate sometimes, some of that pressure that is on sexual activity. And so, questions to ask yourself, ask your partner is, what about sex is appealing? What might be unappealing, right? What elements of that are you in control of? And then what is your goal for being intimate with the partner? Or what is your goal around sexual activity? And what are you hoping to get out of that experience? And so really kind of discerning between sexual activity and this idea of intimacy. And this is just an image, just to give a few, ideas around what are some of the other categories of intimacy. And this can really just broaden our understanding of what intimacy looks like besides the physical, right? Besides sexual activity, besides physical touch. And yeah, remember, right? It is about being close to someone in a manner that is not about what they're doing or what they bring to a table. So this could be, spiritual intimacy, that could be intellectual, like sharing a conversation, that could be experiential, like sharing a different activity together. So this is just, I think, a good reminder and maybe a tool to broaden this idea of what intimacy will look like.
Right. So the model that we are presenting today is called Good Enough Sex on Good Enough Days. So what does that mean? So people with ME/CFS and FM the disease does not take away your sexuality, but it might take away your sexual script, your sexual routine, or your sexual cues. And what are those? And those are the routines, the cues, the script that you used in engaging in sexual activity alone or with a partner. And so if you try those new or those old scripts, things work differently now. And so what's important here is to engage in new ideas and new thoughts and throw out that old script, because it's more likely to be frustrating and very disappointing. Mm-hmm. And what is the ultimate goal when we talk about sex? The ultimate goal is actually connection. So think about this for a moment. Like, sexual activity may be pleasurable to you, but your partner might be totally checked out. An orgasm was great, but your partner wasn't connected with you. And so you start to see that the goal is not performance. It's actually, even if the pleasure was good, but partners are different. And so what we want to do is think about what is the ultimate goal of sex is connection. And we want to look at what is realistic sexual expectations, and also look at what is variable sex, flexible sex. And so this model starts to look at, let's start fresh, and let's present ideas that can work for you. And so what we just said was the goal is not performance. Sex is about connection. And what do we need in place to be connected? And think about the possibilities that can open up. So if the ultimate goal is connection, this opens up a lot of possibilities of what sex and intimacy can look like. What ingredients need to be in place? So ingredients are developing that intimate connection can sometimes be the first step of wanting connection, feeling that connection. And then what about that ability to connect? And that when we start to connect, we often feel connected with our partners. And again, that can lead on to, and Jen will get into this more, about maybe a sexual activity. So it's not about the past scripts. It's about that connection. How do we create that connection? And what are the ingredients we need to have in place in order to feel that connection?
Yeah. And so that's sort of the first aspect, right, of good enough sex. This idea of the goal is not performance. The second one is realistic sexual expectations. I do really like this little image, but right, the idea here is that less than 50% of the time, sexual activity is actually great for both people, right? Most of the time it will be like good for one and okay for the other, or like just fine for both. Or, in general, like the general population, like sex is not Hollywood sex. It's not always super great. It's generally, so it's okay. And so, yeah, having this realistic sexual expectation that it's not going to be great every time for both partners. And a big part of this too is to kind of know how your sexual desire works. And there's generally sort of two aspects to that. And one we would call like readiness or responsive desire, and one we would call spontaneous desire. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but knowing that not every person sort of their desire works the same way. And so if that doesn't match, we need to look at the realistic expectation to see how can we adjust that. And so this is a very busy slide. It is in here more for sort of reference. Rick will share the slides. I think he'll email them out after. And so this is sort of just to kind of look at after, so don't get too overwhelmed looking at this. But I wanted to have a visual of this sort of side by side, just to kind of get an idea, right, that how different this can look like. And so this is this visual representation of these two different types of sexual response. So one is the linear model, which is more what we would call spontaneous desire. And one is the circular model, which we would call like readiness or responsive desire. And that circular model was researched by a researcher called Bassam at UBC in 2000. And so it really actually shifted the way we look at sexual response, because previously everyone thought it's just this linear thing. So for the partners present here as well today, think about what's your kind of response and what's your partner's, and does that match, or how is this different? Because that will definitely impact sort of maybe how you initiate, and like as Sunny was saying, what your sexual script might be. And I heard a really great analogy of these two models where you think of one as the microwave. Boop, boop, you put like the few buttons, ingredients in place, and off you go. And then the other one is the crock pot, right? Where it lots of ingredients, slow to warm up, and it takes longer, right? So it's like microwave and crock pot types of desire in this sense. And so so go a little further into this, in the sense that, again, in society, we often really only talk about spontaneous desire, right? That's the one most people know about, and maybe have this expectation that this is how it's going to be for everyone. Both of these are equally important. There's no good or bad or wrong or right about what kind of desire might happen. And basically for this spontaneous desire, it's sort of this internal drive, this like, I feel like having sex right now. And versus the readiness desire, where you feel more neutral towards sex. You're not feeling like you want it, you don't want it. It's just you're kind of neutral about it, and it's not on your mind. But the ingredients are there. For example, you might have enough energy. You're not in too much pain. There's privacy, and then possibly there's stimuli, so like your partner might initiate, and this feeling of like, oh yeah, I could be sexual right now. And then so the readiness is there. And then once it gets started, right, this feeling of like, oh yeah, this is kind of nice. And afterwards, let's do this more often. So this is more of a representation of that readiness desire. So if dealing with pain or dealing with ME/CFS fibro, you are possibly more likely to kind of fall under that readiness desire category. It's often women, but it's not just women. So in that research, when you kind of look it up, it's often referenced to women, but when you actually looked at the original article, it is for both men and women. It's just not as common in men, but it might both be in the readiness desire category. And that's good to know about each other. And so really what happens, this circle, that was on the other slide, gets kick-started, when that's all in place, there's a sexual stimuli. So let's say the partner initiates, and, the sexual arousal will happen first. So sort of the body, think of the crock, but the body kind of comes first, and the body responds, and then the mind follows, and the mind goes like, oh yeah, this, this feels nice. Okay, I'm here. And then this will usually be followed, by some kind of emotional or physical satisfaction. I think, again, it's really important to note that this does not have to be orgasm for either partner. There's many other ways to kind of feel a sense of resolution and physical or emotional satisfaction at that stage. And then this can lead to emotional intimacy, right? And again, which then in turn will lead to future readiness and receptiveness, again, for sexual activity. So people with more spontaneous desire in that circular model, they kind of, there's a stimuli, so that happens, and then arousal happens, and they're kind of jumping in there. So it starts with desire, then followed by arousal, versus the readiness one that kind of starts with arousal. I'm just going to maybe go back for a second, right? And so when you look at that circular model, the spontaneous desire person with the linear model can sort of jump right in, where, either at sexual arousal or at sexual stimuli, really kind of any point, versus with the circular model, it takes longer and a few more things have to be in place to kind of actually get to the place of arousal and sexual desire. So that's just, something to know about yourself, possibly, or about your partner. And yeah, that it's not right or wrong, but it will inform, how you might go about it, or what kind of sexual script or, cues or routine you develop with each other, right? They're just sort of two different pathways. So when we think, right, about flexible, variable sex, yeah, this flexibility in how desire happens for each one of us, right? This sort of what's realistic in terms of expectations here. Yeah, and so then, we talk about goals, performance. Okay, what are, there's not going to be Hollywood sex. What are realistic expectations? Sort of know your kind of sexual desire, are you a microwave? Are you a crockpot? What's happening there? And then this idea of a variable, flexible sex. So, this thought around that for many people, basically this sexual menu that you've developed, and that Sandy was talking already a little bit about, might be quite narrow, because that might have been something that has worked for you in the past, that might have worked for you before your illness, or before having children, or before whatever, right? Like various life events. And that can feel really frustrating, because if it's not working anymore, it can feel like you're really stuck there. And especially for a lot of heterosexual people, in that sexual menu, it's often very focused on penetration. And there's so many other things, right, that one can do to be sexual, to be intimate. Think back to that image of the 5 different categories of intimacy. So what can you do to sort of create and expand on this idea of your sexual menu or your sexual script? What kind of activities might be part of that, so that you can be flexible and variable, that when maybe energy is lower or pain is up, that there is alternatives, that it's not just this one script that you've had for a really long time. And so I'm glad partners are here today. This is a conversation you might have together. One thing to keep in mind, that brain fog is a real thing. And so if you talk about this and alternatives and maybe brainstorm ideas, for the non-brain fogged partner, it might be really helpful to write this down or to document this somehow, because it's going to be really hard otherwise probably to remember this later, or to kind of stay on the conversation. So when looking at this, right, how can I broaden this menu? It can be tricky to come up with stuff. And so one thing that you might use is sort of, find some help with that, especially think about a non-penetrative sexual menu, right? It's not just this one thing or this one script. And a really great example for that, it's called Mojo Upgrade, and the link is in here, and I think it's also in the resources. And it's a free website, and it's basically a questionnaire that you fill out, and then your partner fills out, and your partner can't see your answers, and you can't see their answers. It'll only show you the answers that you both agreed on. So it gets quite graphic. It goes in kind of all directions, and it might be really fun to do, or have some fun with that to see what ideas you might not thought about, or that you didn't know that you like and your partner likes. You just maybe have never kind of come up with it. So this is this idea of creating this. This might take some time, right? Like build this up over time, and to think about what else can go on this menu that's not, in quotes, sex. So that could be massage, that could be showering together, that could be cuddling or holding each other, that could be brushing. There's this thing called sensate focus. So there's other options. Again, Rick will mail this out. There's an article on sensate focus. This is a thing developed by Masters and Johnson coming out of couples therapy, which is a touching exercise to kind of rebuild intimacy with the express rule that this cannot lead to sexual activity. Because often, when one person starts touching, the stress goes up because maybe the expectation or the fear is there, oh, this is going to lead to sexual activity, but I'm in pain, I'm going to be in worse pain, and then stress level goes up. And so sensate focus is a way to connect through touch, where there's really specific rules on how to go about it. So, people are interested, go check it out. Yeah, so these are all the things when we think about good enough sex, right? It's about connection. What are realistic expectations? So what is your kind of desire? Is it responsive? Is it spontaneous? And to have a broad sexual menu. All right, so let's talk about, that was good enough sex. Let's talk about what good enough days mean. Here we go.
Yeah, so again, the model is good enough sex on good enough days. And so we've talked, like Jen said, good enough sex. Good enough days is introducing the idea that good enough days refers to dealing with the day-to-day variabilities of these symptoms. So what comes up to mind is this idea of, as you can see on the screen, a stop sign and go. And that readiness desire is helpful for understanding how you might experience a sexual desire, but it's not helpful if the baseline conditions for readiness desire have not been met. And so the day-to-day factors that can be a red light versus a green light. And so when we think about this, a green light is things that say, we're good to go. And that can be emotional connection. It can be the partner's appearance. It can be a novelty. And so all those things are often good to go. Things that actually sort of put that stop sign up are physiological strain. And so those are the fatigue, the pain, aging, emotional strain. So anxiety and depression, like Jen said, if I, am touching someone and I'm feeling connected and the expectation is that will lead to sex, that might be, the anxiety might go up, and then all of a sudden there's definitely a red light. Relationships, a lack of emotional intimacy, a lack of privacy, and then family trouble. So what you want to do is think about the day-to-day factors that can be a red light or a green light. And going back and thinking about those physiological symptoms, at the end of the day, your partner hands you a platter, of sleep or sex. Which would you take? If fatigue's an issue of aging, you might actually not want sex at the end of the day. You might be absolutely, there's nothing left in that energy envelope of mine. Emotional, high anxiety, when we're in that really anxious state, we've definitely stimulated our sympathetic nervous system. And that's our fight, flight, and flee. That's the last thing your body's thinking about is sex. And so anxiety is really important. Trauma is a big one. You know, if sexual activity reminds you of a past trauma, that can bring a lot of flashbacks and difficult to want to be sexual. Then there's the interpersonal relationships. So if you're fighting with your partner, there's no emotional intimacy. There's inadequate stimulation, as Jen said. When we talk about this readiness, there's multiple sort of pieces in that puzzle to basically get arousal going. Privacy, lock the door. Social cultural influence is also a conflict with religions or family values and all those things that can go into that. So good enough days is when there's more green light than red light. And on our next slide, this is actually like a worksheet that a lot of partners and the patients might be really interesting, because it's really important to figure out what are the factors that are hitting that red light. And there's 4 columns. And what you want to do is kind of get a piece of paper, fold it into 4, and each column is one of those categories. And then go through the worksheet and think about all the possibilities that are turning on that red light. And it's really important that most people think that a good day or a good enough day is basically that green light. And if they kind of think, to make that green light, what if I just do something like maybe change my clothing, wear perfume? But if that actually isn't, there's still more red lights, no matter how hard we push on the green light, it's not going to go anywhere. So really important to actually figure out what is causing the red light and how can we remove some of that interference basically from letting me go forward. So go through each column and try and figure out things that are hitting that red light. Is it pain? Is it I'm arguing with my partner? I'm stressed because I'm taking care of my parents. All these things have a big impact on that red light versus green light. But just remember that if we can't hit the green light, if all that we're focused on is the red light, and no matter how much we try and push on that green light, if there's more on the red light, we're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, and so this is just an example, of what a possible filled out worksheet could look like. And I think, again, an empty one is in the resources that will be emailed out. And so, this would be possibly a really typical image of this. And so, when you're looking at, pain, fatigue, maybe migraine stiffness, and then, worry that you're feeling unsexy, worry that the partner might leave me, feeling low. And then in that relationship column, right, for the partner, it might be avoiding initiation for fear of kind of being shut down, right? Of like saying, no, I can't do it, in this fear of rejection. That's something as well, which can lead to a decrease in this emotional connection, right? That feeling of intimacy. And then life steps. So maybe you're caring for elderly parents. Maybe your kids still live at home, which really can impact privacy. Again, lock those bedroom doors. And so, it might look like something like this or a bit different, but so think about when you kind of, identify all these things, think about the ones that have the heaviest weight, or that are the brightest, red lights on this table. And to then think about, okay, if I could remove those, would I be more ready? Would I be more responsive to be sexual, right? Would that be more of a good enough day? So then having identified those, the next step we would go into sort of problem solving mode to say, what can we do with these 3 or 4 things? Because as Sandy was saying, if we just kind of hit that green light button harder, those really heavy, bright red light things will still be there. And you're kind of getting really stuck, and that can get really frustrating. And so, right, what can we do here? So let's say, slide change. Let's say you've identified, maybe the 2 brightest red lights that you have on your plate are actual, or on that stop sign are, let's say pain and fatigue. That might totally be true. However, with ME/CFS and fibro, don't assume that the biggest red lights, the brightest red lights are actually ME/CFS or FM symptoms. It could very well be in any of the other categories as well, right? And so, often people think, oh, it's my symptoms. But as you fill out this sheet, and that's why this can be so helpful, you might really realize that actually your red lights are related to some other stressor that you're experiencing that may or may not even have been present before onset of illness. You might have had a bit more buffer before illness, whereas now that's narrowed down. And so it's become a heavier item on there, right? That could be connection with a partner or other stressors. So the idea is, right, identify those brightest red lights, the heaviest items, to then see how could we possibly remove them. What are some strategies or tips here in order to get to a good enough day, right? And then the readiness and the responsiveness for sexual activity will be much, much higher, because before that, it's probably not going to happen. And so, thinking about that problem solving a little bit, obviously this is going to be really different for each one of you and for each partner as well. But this idea of adapting sort of as we go. And we're going to talk just about a few tips and tricks. I want to say the bigger concept ideas. And then as always, with all the strategies we talk about, it's always about customizing that. What would that look like for you?
Right, thanks. And so I think Jen's first sentence on here is sexual activity is exercise. And one of the things that's really frustrating for people with ME/CFS and FM is energy and pain can be completely unpredictable. And so communication and understanding intimacy between partners is really, really important. So when we think about exercise and we think about sexual activity, and this is why it often comes up when we're talking about movement and activity, because it is an exercise. Sex is equal to walking briskly uphill. And so when you think about that, often, people avoid that because that's a lot of energy. And so it's really important to use those principles of pacing and to go as slow as your body needs. Being slow allows you to conserve a little bit of that energy and be have a much better plan. And this is important for partners too, so that you can think about how can I support pacing during a sexual activity. And then plan to have sex during that time of day when you have the most energy and the least pain. And interesting enough, when most people think about sex, they think about night, and probably that's the worst time for people with ME/CFS because literally there's nothing left in the tank. So plan, what time and what part of the day am I best? Mm-hmm. And then choose sex positions that are least tiring and painful for you. And so posture is really important, again, when we think about this, because if we choose a posture that requires less energy, more successful in that sexual encounter. And then look into sex accessories that support your body during sex and stimulate you without using as much energy. And we're going to go into a couple of those in a couple of slides. But really, the whole idea here is to think about pacing again, to think about energy, and to think about how much energy can I conserve versus use in that sexual activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then pain, and pain is also really, really tricky because, again, it's unpredictable. You can start your day off feeling great, and then by mid-afternoon, you're in agony. And so often when we get into that, we have to recognize that's, again, I've activated my sympathetic nervous system. I'm in that fight, flight, and fear. Sex is not in my mind. So these are really important to think about. What can I do to relax my body before sex? And sometimes things like massage are helpful. Sometimes warmth, so a warm shower or a warm bath it can be very helpful. So getting into that more relaxed state before being intimate and promoting that calmer state of mind is really, really important. And again, plan for the time of day when you're at least in pain. And often fibro patients say mornings are the worst for them. And so again, think about what is the best time for you. And also, when we're in pain and it's unpredictable, remember that the ultimate goal of sex is connection. And is there something else? What is a counterbid? And we're going to get into that in a minute. Can I cuddle? Can I brush? Can I have a warm shower together? Is that sunset focus? Would that be helpful to, so think about, as Jen, we keep thinking about, broaden that menu, that your resources, your all those things that you could put into place versus being disappointed that I'm in too much pain and sex is not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, for the partners here to remember, right, that especially with pain, it can really change a lot. So what worked last time, not maybe going to work this time. And so, as Sandy was saying, with this broadening of the menu, can you come up with hand signals, with cues, with the tap, whatever, to guide each other so that, you can be really responsive to each other in terms of what's happening with the pain. And so this is really sort of on both partners, like during the sexual activity. So Sandy was talking a little bit about this offers for connection. So, and we talked about this idea of broadening the menu. And so let's say, one partner initiates sexual activity and the other person has so many things that are really bright on their stoplight that it might not happen. This feeling of rejection is real, and it can, it can be hard sometimes to not take it personal or to not feel hurt. And so I think a really good thing to understand, as Sandy was saying as well, coming back to this ultimate goal is connection. And so interaction and relationship happens through offers for connecting with each other. And this can be verbal, this can be nonverbal. And when someone turns away, when you turn towards the offer of connection, this signals, hey, I hear you, I understand you, I also want to connect. This is coming out of couples therapy as a phrase, coined, they're calling it bids and counterbids for connection out of the New Gottman Institute. So again, if this rings a bell for you, like, I want to know more, that's where you would go. And so, but looking at different studies, right, basically they have found that, partners that are together, that are happiest, they more often turn towards each other than they turn away from each other when an offer for connection was made. And, this could be verbal, like, oh, the sun is shining today. And then the connection would be like, oh yeah, that's really nice. Versus, I don't want to know what the weather is like. Like, why are you telling me, right? That would be a turning away. And so, this idea of turning towards as, hey, I want to connect to, I hear you, I'm here. And, looking at what happens when we towards an offer, it really fills that emotional bank account that two people have together. And this is a joint bank account, right? Every time you turn towards each other, you put a penny in. And every time you turn away, you take 5 pennies out. So the idea is, can you more often turn towards, so the ratio is really 5 to 1. right? For each time you want to turn away, you want to put 5 pennies in, turn towards each other to maintain like a really good sort of emotional bank account there. So that's sort of this idea, right, around how do we connect as people with each other, and what happens when we turn towards, or what happens when we turn away. And so, why do we sort of talk about this when we talk about intimacy and when we talk about sexual activity? Because generally the initiation of sexual activity is an offer to connect, right? It's a turn towards physical connection, right? And then when there's a whole bunch of stuff on your big stop sign, instead of turning away and saying nope, and kind of turning away from this offer, to turn towards and say, hey, what can I make a counter offer? Can I make a counter offer to this bid to connect, let's say through sexual activity? This is something to definitely discuss before sexual activity is initiated. This is not a discussion to have had like during the midst of it, right? That is not a good place to do that. So this is something where you come together, again, at a good time of day for brain power, to kind of talk about, what does it mean for each other, right? We want to turn towards each other, recognize, we want to connect. Can you get to know yourself and your partner? Take time to explore that. Like, what would a meaningful encounter look like, right? So again, for partners as well, think about what would you find meaningful as a counter offer for sexual activity, right? When you meet a stop sign because there's too many heavy things on that red light, and you receive a counter offer from your partner because they're saying, yeah, I'm here, I want to connect. What would be meaningful to you, right? And this is definitely something to discuss together. Another cool resource, unfortunately, this one is not free, is called OMG Yes. It was developed and researched with women in mind. And so that kind of goes through a whole range of just knowledge and videos and education and questions to really actually get to know, what is meaningful? What do you like? You can do that by yourself. They have actually some really lovely couple options where, again, it's kind of aimed at women, but that doesn't mean the other person can't look at that. And so, yeah, if you feel like, oh, this is really hard to come up with stuff, besides Mojo Upgrade, this might be another, just a resource that is, that can be nice to look into, to kind of get a broader idea of, hey, what's our menu? What are counter offers that are meaningful, so that you can turn towards more often and have this connection. Okay. How to talk about it. It's not easy.
No, and I was just thinking, Jan, how do we talk about this? We are talking about throwing out the old and incorporating new. We're talking a new menu. We're talking different ways to look at sex, to look at intimacy, to look at connection. And so where do I start all this? Because it does need some conversations. And it's really important actually to choose a time to talk to your partner that's not during a sexual activity. So we can't start these conversations in the middle of a sexual activity, or it's just going to blow up. So pick a time during the day that you're not involved in a sexual activity. Really important to start talking about what is this responsive desire versus spontaneous desire. Which camp am I in? Which camp is my partner in? Discuss what's impacting that stop sign on both sides. What's the, on the partner side and as well as the patient side. And look at because remember, if those are bright red, no matter how hard we push on the green, it's not going to happen. And then, so we call this a stress reducing conversation. And stress reducing conversations, again, are part of, that couples therapy, that couples sort of menu. And really what it is setting the time to talk to each other every day. And during this, there's 3 major principles, and these talks don't have to be long. They're not 30 and 40 minutes an hour. They can be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but just that consistency of, having that conversation. And there's 3 major principles. Support your partner. Never side with the enemy. So what that means is if your partner brings up something, let's say, at work today, the manager was being really, disrespectful. And what you don't want to do is say, well, maybe the manager was disrespectful because of what was going on. We never side with the enemy. We always support the partner. And empathize how your partner feels. And that's an interesting one, that word empathize. It's not sympathy. It's actually feeling what they're feeling. And sometimes, that's can be a bit uncomfortable for some people, like, what am I feeling? And sometimes even just getting a feeling wheel out and looking at all the different types of feelings that I can have so that I can start to understand what is empathy versus sympathy. Nobody wants sympathy, but they do want to be understood. They do want people to feel what they're feeling in an empathetic way. And the biggest one, and this is not a problem-solving session, unless your partner asks for it. But often sometimes it can become problem solving, only if you could do this, or you could do that, or why don't we, this is a time to really sort of listen to each other and go through all the things that we have presented today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that problem solving, right, it often comes out of a desire to make it better, to help, but for that person, it's actually not helpful. This is part really of reducing stress, which means feeling heard, feeling seen, feeling connected. So these are just 3 good things to keep in mind when having these conversations. Okay, so obviously we're the OT and the physio, so we're definitely also going to talk a little bit about, how can you adapt your environment? So thinking about sex or sexual activity as totally an occupation, like it's something we do, it's an activity. And just as when we talk about pacing, as we would talk about adapting your environment and adapting posture and positioning and all of that, this applies to sexual activity as well. So this idea of, sexual accessories or sexual furniture, really whatever you want to call it. The idea is, how can you support your body as best as possible in this activity? And that might mean, can you make your environment work better for you with adaptations? How do you need to support your body? Can you change your posture, positioning? And so, especially when there is, pain and fatigue on your red light, on your stop sign, using some of this can really help to bring that down and to make your body feel really supported. And so, basically, a good position for sexual activity is one that will let you do what you want to do and let you touch what you want to touch, right? And so, and touch the parts of your partner that you want to touch and yourself. And so this is this idea, can you be comfortable? So we're going to look, is there pillows that assist with positioning? Is there bolsters? There might be wedge cushions. So that what you see on the slide here, those images are taken from the website called Ergo Erotics on the slide as well. So these are really a bit more specialized, but often, regular pillows will do. You might roll up a blanket or a towel and use that somehow. So there's definitely, you don't have to go buy stuff. You can definitely also use what you already have, but this is just to get an idea of what this could look like. It can help prop your body up or support different sexual positions. For example, you might rest your foot on a bolster, right? And you might use a hand harness. And the idea is, can you reduce strain? Can you reduce repetitive movement? And can you really reduce, again, like energy output? And that's this idea. So in terms of positioning and bolster, so again, in the resources, there is actually a whole handout on different positions, right? Because think about the menu, the sexual script. In the past, you might have had your 3 go-to positions, and now they're not working anymore, possibly. So you want to, look at that and try stuff out. Unfortunately, the resource handout that we found, it's very heteronormative. So just keep that in mind as you look at that. The other thing is, can you adapt in the sense of looking at vibrators, look at handheld devices, at possibly a depth customizer. So again, kind of keeping pain in mind. If penetration is really painful, like a depth customizer might be really nice, that you can really control sort of the depth of penetration. If you have pain in your wrist or your arm or your elbow, using, actually a thigh strap can be really helpful. So your hands and elbows are free. Or if repetitive movement is a thing, you might use a harness on your hand. And so again, this is sort of like, I would compare these probably to using a shower chair, to using a cane, to use a long-handled shoehorn or like a sock aid. Like this is equipment to reduce strain, to support your body, and to save energy while engaging in sexual activity. So this is really, when we talk about it, like, can we reduce the demand on our energy while still hopefully enjoying sexual activity? And you might have looked at these kind of things before, you might have not. Again, I think of it as this idea of like the shower chair. And again, for partners, right, this might be something that you can explore together. Maybe you can both go off, explore on your own, and then come together and be like, hey, check out what I found, right? Definitely, this can be a really joyful, or also sometimes maybe silly conversation to have as you broaden this sexual menu, this script. Just a quick reference here, this is not an exhaustive list of sort of resources. We have, again, we're putting it out, there's a whole list of different resources around this topic, but the highlights basically that I wanted to highlight here is 2 books. Rick mentioned one, The Aches, Pains, and Love by Kira Lynn, and the other one is called The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability. And those are both 2 fantastic books to reference and look at. And then also in terms of the websites, these are the ones that we've mentioned in the presentation. And then Go Ask Alice, great website just for all kinds of questions you may or may not have that you might not want to ask a provider, but that you want an answer to. So that's a really good place to go. Yeah, look at that, Sandy. We are timing wise. Perfect timing. So, and also I think these will be sent out, and I popped just some of the references in here as well. Okay, whew. Power it through, 6 o'clock. All right, so this is the time for question and answers. I'm just gonna pull up my Q&A box. And we might take a little bit of time to kind of go through and see sort of, which ones are really appropriate for us to answer here. Okay, so the first one, basically, I would, this idea around activity. My partner is very active. I would recommend come to one of the pacing sessions. We're going to talk a lot about energy management, really for things like hiking, for going to events, stuff like that. So this is not quite the venue for that, but in pacing, we will talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and also remember, we can totally read out success stories that you want to share. All right, and so I think this is just a share from Juliana to say, I have I don't actually know how to pronounce that.
Vestibular. So, and I'm now alone for 6 years, and I'm happy, and I don't have to worry about sex. I find myself hoping I would meet any.
I don't meet anyone.
I'm interested in having a relationship with. The pressure of sex in a relationship is too much for me. I hope, Juliana, we addressed that the real purpose is connection, and that the menu is wide and vast.
Yes, and also you don't necessarily need a partner to engage in sexual activity, right? If that is something that that's on your plate, there is many ways to engage in sexual activity on your own. Absolutely. Okay, yes, we're gonna send out the slides after. Yes, so this is just a great comment. Perhaps this training will not be based on binary genders in the future. There are many, many trans and gender diverse folks living with this illnesses. Absolutely right. Yeah, we're kind of coming at it from this perspectives of our knowledge base right now. I do recognize that some of the handouts, as I said, they're very heteronormative. We didn't create those, and so those were the best ones we could find. And like always, please, exercise your own best judgment of which parts go where. That's really up to you. As long as it's consensual, like it's all good. I think the idea of a sexual script goes for anyone, right? This thought of that how we initiate being sexual can change with illness, and that this might be an approach to broaden that and to be able to engage in this again, hopefully safely and in your energy envelope. But yeah, thank you for that comment.
And this is a lovely success story with Al, and it talks a lot about sort of energy management. And I don't love lingering foreplay or post-coital engagement. I just love rolling over and going to sleep. I love hugs and kisses and snuggles and touch, and often stampeded to the finish line or orgasm. My partner is the opposite, so having to develop new ways of moving and touching and being touched, all of the ways of expressing my sexuality, it has closed the gap on our sexual differences. Lovely. We find that foreplay can mean so many things throughout the day, and that intimacy can be holding hands while watching a movie or cooking together or doing breath work together. How lovely. And that sex can be slow and calm and gentle, and sometimes without orgasm. I have less intercourse, but way more of an intimate connection. And that's proven to be very satisfying for both of us. So amazing and so lovely, because really at the end of the day, it's about connection and how do we feel that connection. And that's, thank you, Elle.
Yeah, thanks for sharing some of those stories as well. I do believe there is a recording that will be, Rick, you said it's going to be on YouTube, right? So that was a question of just like how to access the recording. I don't know if you can speak to that real quick. Have we lost Rick? Possibly. Okay, it's gonna be probably on YouTube. And then I can't actually speak to the next session, so check out the website.
There was another one. Can you please go over response desire and spontaneous desire again?
I'm having problems with my mouse, so sorry about the delay. Yeah, you'll get an invitation and a link to our YouTube channel. So it'll be the same link for all the videos, and we will be putting the slides beside the video. So everything will be there in one place for you.
Thank you. Okay, so response desire and spontaneous desire. So I'm not a scientist and researcher into like sexual health per se. The way I look at it, or how I understand it, and the reference to the article is on the slide, and you can, it's actually, and I actually have it, so I can send that to Rick, maybe to send out with the slides, that original article on that research. So you can definitely read up on it. But basically, the thought of spontaneous desire is that it's quite linear, right? So this thought is like, oh, I want to have sex, and then you initiate. It kind of goes into that release. So the desire is there first, the feeling of like, oh, I would like to have sex right now. And then the arousal happens, right? And so the mind is engaged first, and then the body kind of follows. And with the readiness or responsive desire, it's often that the stimulus happens. So let's say, maybe cuddling or touching or a compliment or whatever. And so that the body responds first, right? So the arousal happens first, and then the desire happens. So imagine as like, oh yeah, this kind of feels good. So you're neutral towards sex. You're not feeling like, oh, I totally want to have sex right now, but you're also not feeling like, I totally don't want to have sex right now. The stimulus happens. The body kind of warms up, going like, oh yeah, okay, this feels good. And then the mind follows. So then the arousal happens, the desire happens. And then that would lead hopefully to some kind of resolution. So often that might be emotional connectedness or emotional intimacy that can be part of that resolution. Hope that made sense. It's a bit much to sometimes wrap your head around that. Yeah, so I recommend to possibly look at that original article as well.
Here's one from Liz. Thanks for the great presentation. I appreciate the idea of changing expectations. I heard a keynote speaker at a men's health conference once talking about sex and aging. He asked what parts of the body are involved in sex. That's a very interesting question, with different. He answered that when you age, the body parts that come to mind are my wrists, my back, my knees. Those body parts may come to mind when thinking about sex and disability too. Thank you for the information.
Thanks, Liz. And then we have Perrin, what's your view on tantric sex for FM, MECFS patients? Great presentations. I don't have a view. I don't really know much about it. So I'm sorry, I can't really speak to that. I think my general impression would be, can you stay within your energy envelope? Can you be sustainable about it? Is it consensual? Does it bring you joy? Great, go for it.
Absolutely.
I don't know if Rick has any thoughts on that.
There goes that mouse again.
Mouse trouble.
You guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I know nothing about it. I know the book looks interesting, and I never realized there's so many positions. So if you can find positions that are comfortable for you, go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the same idea again, right? Can you support your body, right? Can you avoid strain and really a lot of repetitive motion that might elicit pain? So can you feel supported and safe in your body? Great. Okay, here we have a share from Jennifer. I feel very blessed to have a partner that got into relationship with me while I was in recovery from a very bad crash flare up of a few years. The open conversation, he has been wonderful with pacing, checking in, changing position, slowing down. I never feel pressured to perform or that intimacy always needs to lead to sexual activity. Yeah. He has been so open-minded. I feel very grateful, as I didn't think this level of intimacy was possible through this illness. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
And what a great example, right? This idea of intimacy is not just sexual activity. It can be, but it doesn't have to be, right? And that intimacy is being with someone not because they bring something to the table or they're doing something. I think, that's this idea of taking that pressure away, that feeling intimate needs to lead to any kind of activity, right? Any kind of that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah. And it really, really goes back to the ultimate goal is connection and feeling connected. Um, I've here it keeps jumping out. I've been one that prefers a connection. However, my experience that men I've met tend to want to get it on like the movies. Hollywood has screwed up what people think of as sex or intimacy. Couldn't agree with you more.
Absolutely. Remember, you know, when we think about real life, that it's not all sex. It's the 50% or less not great for both, right? It might just be okay. It might be good for one and meh for the other. And so I think that can bring a lot of pressure and fear of into sexual activity. And so I think coming back to how to talk about it and also stress reducing conversations, right? And hopefully we lead down a path where eventually that might be addressed in conversation as well. Yeah.
For sure.
Okay.
My partner does not like to touch except as a way to initiate a sexual encounter. Less sex equals hardly any touch. Less intimacy of any sorts. I have taught them about 20 seconds hug morning and night. Nicer.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Again, coming back to that wheel of intimacy. And so again, you know, some partners might actually not really like a lot of touch or hugging or petting or whatever, and then go look at that wheel and see, you know, what other ways are there. It might sensate focus might be something to look into if both want to work on touch that might not necessarily lead to sexual activity. And also this idea of can we have a very defined frame of like, let's hug, let's hold hands, like what kind of touch might be nice and helpful and acceptable again for both partners. Absolutely.
And brings you joy. Like I think sometimes, you know, touch for a lot of people isn't comfortable. So hugging 20 seconds in the morning and at night, lovely. Yeah.
Okay.
Someone once said intimacy is intimacy, not just sex, but all the ways you see and show up for your partner. So true.
I like that. Intimacy. Like, how do we see into each other, right? Thanks for sharing that. Okay, I've been trying to date and increase my social circle. I've noticed a change in the conversation after I say I've been on disability since 2014, being a 42-year-old. The judgment hurts. Any advice? Oof, yes,
That's hard.
really, really hard. In terms, I don't think I have any great advice, unfortunately. I think, again, this reminder that we can control what we say, how we behave. We can recognize our own emotions, and we can't control other people's emotions, right? And so that can be really difficult when either sharing information or also setting a boundary to not know, you know, what's the other person going to say, how are they going to react. And really coming back to this, that, you know, how can you possibly, you know, I don't really quite have the words to kind of put out what I'm having in my mind right now, but it's really difficult.
And I think, Krista, it's all in timing too, you know. When do I disclose certain information? When do I? And then those are difficult and sensitive topics. And I think sometimes it goes down back to that stress reducing conversations, is being in a calm place and talking openly about these. And if there's no empathy there or there's no understanding, that's it.
And then also just probably recommend, Rick was mentioning the session coming up around relationships, because it sounds like, you know, you're broadening your social circle, you're putting yourself out there in dating. And that's a whole kind of different ballgame, as well as if you are in a relationship with someone and kind of coming from that perspective. So I'm not sure when that's happening. Check out the website. I'm sure that'll be announced there. So that might be actually a place where you hopefully get a bit more insight, especially on this idea of dating and disclosing, right, with someone new. Yeah.
It's a very complex.
Okay.
I think a sense of connection varies with individuals. Absolutely. I'm going to suggest we each make a list of when or how we feel connected.
Yeah, I like that. I'm a big fan of lists of kind of menus of writing it down. Because brain fog happens, it's hard to remember sometimes. And again, what feels meaningful for each one of us is different. And if we're with someone that has a lot of stuff on their red light, what would be a meaningful thing for me as a counter offer, right? That would make me feel connected and seen. And the other way around too, like if I have a lot of my stop sign, what counter offer is meaningful to me that I can make that conveys this feeling of, yeah, I'm here, I want to connect as well. Absolutely.
I think that's a really lovely way of opening up that conversation. We assume what connection looks like, and we assume what feels good for me to be connected, but we need to maybe talk about that with our partners.
Okay. Oh my goodness, no more questions. I don't think we've ever gotten through all of our questions.
No, we have not.
Well, any more success rate questions? This is your chance. I think other than that, that's it for, one more. Let's see. Oh yeah, this idea of I feel loved when, right? That'd be maybe a really good way to collect this for each other. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me write that down.
Yes, thank you, everybody. And thanks to Sandy and Jen. And we'll have this posted soon, and Bruno will send you the slides. Have a great week, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.